So, first of all, I would like to introduce you Dr. Hearne. He is former president of Material Research Society. He is the director of the Center for Nanophase Materials and Sciences at the U.S. Department of Energy. And also, he is invited review editor of the Journal of Material Science at Spring Nature Publications. So, and of course, he has a voice in the field of materials, and it is for us. Also, he is a member of the Academy of Engineering in USA, so it is a great pleasure to have him among us.
Thank you for the kind welcome. Let's see, so I'm going to be walking around a fair amount. You know, I wanted to, when I was thinking about this talk, I wanted to take us in a little bit of a different direction than we normally go in. Normally we spend a lot of time thinking about the science and what's the fundamental physics and chemistry that's occurring in these material systems. But I wanted to just take this opportunity to step back a little bit and talk about some of the economic drivers, about why we're looking at these different aspects of in material systems. And so in particular, I'm looking at the case here of energy storage, and in this case, actually, energy storage for the electric grid. All right, so how does the electric grid work, right? I mean, we all sort of know we plug things in, but thinking about it, right, you know, this is the grid of yesteryears. So there's centralized power stations, there were step-up transformers, you go to the transmission system, step back down again, distribution, and then you have your loads, right? Industrial loads, commercial loads, and residential loads. And power only flows in one direction, right? It flows out from the centralized power plant into these different loads, and generation always must perfectly match the load that's on the system. But our electric grid is evolving, right? In Europe, it's evolving much more rapidly than it's evolving in many other places in the world, so it's particularly germane here, right? You now have generation that's at what used to just be load sites. And so that can be, you know, solar cells or wind turbines. And now you have a case where you need to actually also place energy storage around the grid because you're constantly having these varying loads. So particularly with these renewable systems, which are, as they call, non-dispatchable. So you often hear this term non-dispatchable generation. What that means is the power plant operator can't say, give me an extra gigawatt of power here. You're going to get what you're going to get based off of the conditions at that one particular moment. So this is a plot. This is actually from a document from the Department of Energy and EPRI. It's a few years old now, so it's changed a little bit. But essentially, this is the power versus the hours of the day, where, you know, sorry that the axes didn't show up here, but noontime is right about here. So this peak is about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. So this is the peak. This is the load. This is what we're actually requesting off of, in terms of all of the distributed load centers. Well, so one other point is, see this, there's like a hash on top of this. This is all of us, you know, opening and turning on our microwaves, lights clicking on, lights turning off. So there's this, what they call frequency regulation, which is smoothing out all of this hash mark. And so you'll see this gray line here. And so the gray line is what the power plants need to try to regulate to. So how do we fill this up? How do we create all energy? Right? So there's base load generation. So this is, you know, nuclear power plants and very large coal plants. And this is the most inexpensive electricity to create. And why is it inexpensive? It's inexpensive because you can use large centralized facilities and you don't have to change the throttle at all. You're putting out the same amount of energy at all times. And so it's this actually ramping of the throttle, ramping of how much energy you're needing to produce that drives a lot of the cost of energy storage systems. So this, if you're talking about a number, you're looking 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour to create, or 3 or 4 cents. Yeah. Next up is renewables. So renewables. So in this particular case, it's really wind has this peak that's sort of in the late evening at night, and it drops off during the day. Solar has a peak that occurs a little before the actual peak here in the load. And this, as I said, is non-dispatchable. But still, it generally doesn't quite get us all the way up to where we need to be. All right. as I said, renewables is also fairly inexpensive, right? So now you're talking like 5 cents a kilowatt hour to create that electricity from renewables. Next, we have this intermediate generation. These are often gas-fired turbines. And so these gas-fired turbines are a little bit more expensive. Why are they more expensive? Well, it's this following this load curve. They need to be constantly changing how much energy they're producing. So now you're looking more like 15, 20 cents a kilowatt hour, right? We've gone from 3 cents up to, almost an order of magnitude more expensive for these. Now finally, we have this peak generation. Peak generation, amazingly, is often diesel engines. These are 4-stroke engines or they're diesel cycle engines that are creating this last electricity. So not only is it expensive to create, as you imagine a diesel engine would be, it's also very inefficient. This is one of the major carbon emitters in this entire cycle. So that's definitely something that we'd like to get rid of as a society. Okay, how does energy storage fit into this landscape? Well, I'm just going to pick out 3 of the main application spaces where you'll see grid energy storage and talk about them here. There's actually a list, it's sort of 12 or 13 different places you can apply it, which we'll talk about in a minute. But these are the big 3. So this top one is frequency regulation. This is really just this hash on top. So when you're thinking about grid energy storage, anything that's on the electric grid only makes money for the utilities when there's electrons flowing. So if it's sitting static, you're not actually making much, there's not much return on that investment to the utility, for the utilities of having that there. So frequency regulation is a place where you have low energy demands, but you have high power demands, which is actually a fantastic place for batteries, right? So you don't need a big bank, you just need to have a large area in terms of the anode and cathode so you can drive a lot of power. Because with batteries, typically you're really paying mostly for the energy side of things. So this is a place where batteries can be very effective. And you'll see that in a minute. Okay, so that's frequency regulation. Next is this arbitrage, right? So this is this, can you pump up your base generation to a higher level, store that electricity in some mechanism, and then use it to chop off this peak? Well, this is that, classic buy low, sell high scenario. And you will see some of that. And it's typically, this is actually done with pumped hydro, because that's one of the few places where you can get enough actually energy stored to make this useful. Batteries, it's very hard to get the level of energy you need. And then finally is peak shaving. So peak shaving is very similar to this arbitrage, but it's really only getting just that very top, just where you need to have, say, these diesel engines running. And so this is a place often where you'll see this. So you imagine you have a small village or a hamlet out at the end of a power grid. So there's one line that runs out to it, this is a fairly common scenario. And at the highest load time during the day, they would need to have a small diesel generator there because the power lines themselves can't handle the power, can't take that extra power to actually run it. So rather than having this small diesel generator, you can have a small storage system to just eliminate this peak. So that's another mechanism. Okay, so why is this everywhere? I mean, you probably guessed it by now. It's the cost. There's a tremendous cost in putting energy storage systems, and let's talk about some of this. What's the, what I want to spend a few minutes talking about is what's the cost of a grid energy storage system versus how much value is actually derived from the different applications. All right, so cost. Well, okay, so this is a chart of the drop of prices of lithium-ion batteries. Actually, this chart's it's fairly current. And you can see right now, okay, so currently you're looking at whatever this is. So this is around a little under $300 per kilowatt hour, and it continues to go down. The Department of Energy, their target is $100 a kilowatt hour. This is actually for automotive batteries, so the grid batteries are a little bit less than that. Right, but nominally you're talking about a battery pack is this $300 a kilowatt hour. So this is something that we're often working on, right, and we cite as an area for investment in materials. It's looking at high energy density and low cost material systems. Okay, and what are these challenges that we're working on? Right, material costs, getting rid of rare earths in these. We're talking about materials performance, so energy density. Right, one of the challenges in lithium-ion batteries is that the anode and cathode that you have, the thicknesses are limited. Right, so they're 30 to maybe 100 microns in thickness each. As you can make those thicker, you can get more energy density per battery. But there's mechanical limitations and also the electrical conductance through those anode and cathodes, which are challenges. And then safety. Safety is another aspect which we're very actively involved in. Right, so if you look at a lithium-ion battery, an ethylene carbonate is a typical electrolyte, so an EC or a DEC electrolyte. And these electrolytes, if there's a safety issue, imagine a short between the anode and cathode, which is a fairly common failure mode, it then volatilizes the electrolyte, and that electrolyte rapidly burns. So you'll see if you go on YouTube and you watch some videos of like a pouch cell where they're driving a nail through it. It's a standard test. I don't know how many nails get driven through batteries in reality, but this is a fairly standard test, and what you see is the pouch swells up, and then it ruptures, and then very rapidly it burns. You and I might call it an explosion. They call it rapid burning, or a rapid thermal process, which to me it looks like an explosion. Okay, so we talked about the battery pack itself, right? That's just $300 a kilowatt hour. But that's not what you really need when you put it on the electric grid. You need to have it in a container. Right? So it needs to have some sort of enclosure. It needs to be frequency matched to the grid. And these containers are, they have inverters, they have transformers, they also have air conditioning, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this air conditioning system is really important to the battery systems, right? Because just think about it. We all know that when a battery gets hot, its capacity drops and its efficiency drops. So you need to keep them cool. All right, but how much does all this packaging cost? Well, it's almost $700 a kilowatt hour. So this is actually the main cost driver in a grid energy storage system. And this doesn't even take into account location. If I wanted to put one of these systems in, say downtown New York, this is $1,000 a kilowatt hour. In downtown New York, actually the cost of the property far exceeds the cost of the energy storage system. So this is just thinking about being someplace free that you're putting it. Okay, so that's the cost. What's the value side? This is actually one of my favorite plots. So this was done by, again, by EPRI in about 2010. So it's a little bit on the older side. This is looking at the market within the United States for grid energy storage. So this is the value for a given market in kilowatt hours, and this is the size of a given market in terms of gigawatts. All right, so you see frequency regulation, right? That's what we talked about. That's that high frequency noise on top. The value, so it's $400 a kilowatt hour is what you can charge for that. So that's an area where there's a tremendous amount of profit that could be made, but you can see the market's actually incredibly small. You don't need all that many battery systems scattered around to fully saturate this particular market. Okay, there's this deferred. This is talking about that end-of-line power, so just getting rid of that peak power. And so they call this technology deferment. So they're deferring the costs of putting in that new power line. So that's another area. All right, where's our $1,000 per kilowatt hour line? Well, it's right down there is where it matters, right? So you can get frequency regulation, you can get some of this deferment, but most of the areas where you could apply energy storage and have it be helpful in terms of efficiency aren't necessarily profitable. And that's part of why you don't see grid storage everywhere, is it's not cost effective for the utilities to put it onto the grid. Now there's other things that we as a society need to be considering, right? Are we gaining efficiency? Are we decreasing the amount of carbon that's being put into the atmosphere? What can we do to change what this scenario looks like and that boils down to regulations. And that's us working with our representatives to change what this overall profile looks like. Okay, I was going to talk a little bit more about this heating and air conditioning, right? So this is called the Prosperity site. This is a small site out in New Mexico where they had, 500 kilowatts of PV. They had 750 kilowatts of batteries. It's called Prosperity. It doesn't look terribly prosperous to me, but, well, it's New Mexico. Okay. In this case, they used lead-acid batteries. Why did they use lead-acid? Lead-acid batteries are very inexpensive. So these are advanced lead-acid batteries, meaning they have a little bit of a supercapacitor in series with them. But they're cheap to get. So they're below this $1,000 a kilowatt hour in terms of purchase price. Well, the downside is round-trip efficiency. The batteries themselves, these lead-acid batteries, are only 85% efficient, right? So for every electron you put in, you get 0.85 electrons back out. However, the full system, when you actually account for all the air conditioning, because you need to keep the batteries cool, you need to keep the power electronics cool, which is actually one of the critical pieces, your efficiency drops down to only 59% efficient round trip. And that's assuming that you're putting the electrons in and pulling them almost immediately back out. The longer they're stored there, the less value you derive from the system. This also represents an opportunity for us as material scientists. And that opportunity is in power electronics. So power electronics that are used right now are very typically silicon-based power electronics, right? And the core temperature that you can get to is maybe 120 degrees C for these power electronics, typically. So that means that you're running more like 100 degrees C or 80 degrees C outside it. And with that sort of temperature in these environments where it's running 35 degrees C environments, you need to have active cooling. You can't just use a passive radiator to cool these power electronics. However, as you go to wide bandgap power electronics, so wide bandgap power electronics have a nice, they have an advantage of the wider bandgap, meaning you need less of the actual transistors for doing in the system, but they also tend to be able to run at a hotter temperature. If you can push the operating temperature of the power electronics up to 200 degrees C, and you now enable the use of passive radiators for cooling these power electronics. So you can get rid of this drop in efficiency due to the HVAC system. So that's another another opportunity for us to be looking at as a community. And obviously there are many people that are looking at power electronics, but I just want to encourage people to think about, that one of these aspects that we should be really thinking about is operating temperature and being able to drive that up higher. Okay, degradation. So a number of years ago, we heard a lot of excitement around, when Tesla first announced the cars and they were going out in the market. People were very excited, saying, I'll buy a Tesla, I'll bring it home, at night I'll plug it into the grid, and I'll let the utilities use my Tesla as backup for the grid. It sounds fantastic. It sounds fantastic until you start looking at what the cost of the degradation is of the batteries. Okay, so a battery pack in a Tesla, so a 60 kilowatt hour battery costs $1,200 to replace at 80% of its lifetime. Crunch those numbers and you get, ultimately it costs $1,000 a kilowatt hour replacement cost for these batteries. So that's our old friend, right, that we had for grid batteries. So it sounds pretty reasonable, at least it's in the ballpark. You may be able, this number is coming down slowly, but it's at least, it passes that sort of sniff test. Okay, how fast do the batteries degrade? According to Tesla, their batteries degrade at 0.03% per cycle, which works out to 30 cents per kilowatt hour per cycle. So every time you cycle it, you're losing 30 cents per kilowatt hour. So your 60 kilowatt battery battery is very rapidly losing energy. Well, so what does that work out to? All right, you think about the average cost of electricity, and I think about it in the US, it runs about 9 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, there are some areas in the US, so say if you look in Northwest Texas, so this is the ERCOT utility district. In Northwest Texas, they have a very high number of wind turbines. And there are times during the year when they're creating so much electricity, they actually drive the cost of electricity negative. And so due to the regulations, that negative cost goes to negative 2 cents. So imagine a perfect storm where I could buy electricity at this negative 2 cents and then sell it at 9 cents. I've just made 11 cents. It cost me 30 cents per cycle to run it. So you're still running way in the red. Now, maybe if you get to the very peak times, you could be able to sell it for 25, 30 cents a kilowatt hour, but that's actually not typically how it works in a regulatory environment, what the cost you're allowed to sell it at. Well, so that was a very back of the envelope way of calculating it. There's actually been some people that have done, more appropriate and scientific studies of it, but the answer is still essentially the same. At this point, it's not cost effective to use your car battery for the grid, and actually you're wasting resources due to the degradation rates. So there's a couple of factors there. All right, and what are some of these materials challenges about degradation? So this solid electrolyte interface evolution is a key aspect, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And then certainly mechanical stability of the anode and cathode. So the system's evolving. But these are areas that we're all, as a community, actively working in. But we need to be addressing this degradation piece as another critical aspect. Okay, so a few years ago, Department of Energy put out this study and looked at the challenges of grid energy storage. So I talked about this one, cost competitiveness. This is where a lot of our materials challenges fall in. There's safety and reliability. That's also an aspect for us as material communities. This is that flammability of the electrolytes is one of the main areas. Equitable regulatory environment, I also mentioned, that's looking at how much value is generated for the different market segments. And then industrial acceptance is a piece I didn't really mention going through the presentation, but it is something that it's worth thinking about. Utilities, whenever the power goes out, a utility gets charged. They get fined. So if you have a drop in power, so a brownout or a blackout, a loss of power, there's a bill that comes to the utility company where they get charged or penalized by the government. So they're highly adverse to new technologies. And so there's this piece where we have to demonstrate that the battery systems are highly reliable and won't fail. So that's another challenge that we have that we need to be thinking about. And that generally falls more into the manufacturing side of the house, but it is something that's worth thinking about as a materials community. I pointed to some of these challenges earlier, so in terms of the grid energy storage community, but this is what a number of people have highlighted as areas for us to be working at. Low cost, abundant materials, voltage windows in the electrolyte, though I didn't talk about that. That's another area for us to be looking at. Safety, parasitic processes, thermal limits of power electronics, SEI layers, and et cetera. So these are all topics. So these are all materials topics that we are and need to be working on, but they're directly related to the economics of how grid energy storage will be applied. So let's dig into reliability just a little bit more. And the reason why I want to go into this is an example where really the nanoscience is particularly important of what's going on, or certainly the microstructures. So this is work that was done at Sandia by Katie Young-Johan at the Center for Integrated Nanotechnology, so Katie and her group. as was just mentioned, so I'm currently at Oak Ridge National Labs at the Center for CNMS, the Center for Nanophase Material Sciences. Prior to that, I was at CINT, the Center for Integrated Nanotechnology, where this work was being done. So what is this? So many of you are familiar with the Hummingbird TEM system. So this is, within an electron microscope, there's a number of companies that have been building liquid cells. So you can start to directly look at structural evolution in a TEM in liquids. Sandia, as they have a microfabrication facility of their own, built their own custom platform because they wanted to have multiple electrodes. So this is a schematic. So this is about 5 centimeters, and this is about 3 centimeters this direction. Centimeters. Let's try millimeters. Minor difference. So 5 by 3 in terms of millimeters. In the center, there's a little liquid dam. If you zoom in onto that, you see there's a hole through this. So this is a titanium nitride window that's through the thickness, and you see there's a series of electrodes on it. As you zoom in even closer, these were electron beam written electrodes. So these are around 100 nanometers in terms of the electrode width. Now this is the actual fully assembled system, and you can see this is a cross section. There's the electron beam window through the center, and you can fill the liquid in from the sides. And so they built this particular system because they want to isolate, so Sandia built this because they want to isolate the electrical properties to within the window that you can look at with the TEM. And with the Hummingbird and the other systems, typically right now you're not able to do that. So they want to be able to directly measure the electrical signals in the environment within where they're looking in terms of the electron microscopy. So that's what they've done here. So this is a place where they're plating lithium. All right, so let me back up a little bit. So when you talk about lithium batteries, there's lithium batteries and there's lithium-ion batteries. Normally, we think about lithium-ion batteries. So a lithium-ion battery means that you have lithium that's within an anode material, typically a carbon, and when you discharge it, the lithium moves across into the cathode. And it inserts itself, it moves from being inserted in one material to being inserted in the other. So you can think of two sponges with lithium shuttling back and forth between those two sponges. In a lithium battery, there is no anode material. The lithium is directly plated onto your charge collector. And that's what you have here. So this is a glob of lithium metal that's been directly deposited. So this is a lithium battery. And why do you want a lithium battery versus a lithium-ion battery? Well, energy density. If you can just plate lithium, you're going to have a much higher energy density battery than you would have if you have to insert it into another material. Typically. There are examples where, such as silicon, if you insert lithium into silicon, actually that energy density is higher than pure lithium, interestingly enough. So, sticking with this case of a lithium battery, you can see this is one of those fingers that we looked at earlier. So that's that. So this is a little bit bigger. So this is a 500 nanometer electrical contact. The entire surface. So this is looking in plan view. The entire surface was covered with ALD aluminum oxide. Then there was a small window opened up. So this 500 by 500-ish window within that oxide layer, and then a titanium contact was deposited. And then this was filled with a mixture of ethylene carbon, so ECDMC electrolyte, and then the lithium was deposited. And so you can see it's about 10 milliamps per square centimeter. So sort of a mid-range current there in terms of the deposition rate. Over here is so this is the trace of the current versus time. You see initially there's negative current, so they're plating out the lithium, and you can see the current is actually held constant. So this is a galvanostatic deposition of the lithium, or charging it. You're holding the constant current while depositing the battery. This is the common mechanism that you'll see in the community for when you're actually doing charges of batteries. The bottom trace is the voltage. So how hard are you needing to push on this to actually deposit the lithium. And you see initially, well, what you see is the voltage is driven more and more negative. So what is that saying? That's saying it's getting harder and harder to put your next lithium atom down as you're plating. All right, so here's the starting condition. Here's C as you start to deposit the lithium. All right, and that corresponds to this little arrow right here. So that was the first image. The first TE image was taken at that point. You had a nice smooth curve, so the deposition was going well. You take the image, and now you start to see a little roughness in signal, a little jump, right? And it jumps, so it's getting harder to plate. Well, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that the beam is having some impact on the deposition process or the charging process. All right, they continue it. They take a few more images. You see, it's a little bit hard to see, but outlining these yellow lines is a dendrite that was growing underneath the or above this contact, so it was coming out from underneath. All right, they then run a stripping cycle where they pulled off all the lithium that they could, and they started, right, so they stripped, then they let it sit for a little bit, and then they plated once again. Well, you can see this next time through, so this is this G, when they start looking at it, it's now highly dendritic. So it's no longer this nice, smooth-looking lithium globe. It now has lots of spikes on it. So let's look a little bit more at that. All right. In this case, so they're doing that same deposition rate, so the same 10 milliamps per square centimeter. So it's sort of, again, a mid-rate deposition. Here's the needle again. There's the window and the titanium there in this case. And you start to see the plating forming. And they're taking more images. Each one of these arrows is an image they took. So C or B corresponds to one of the first images of the platings. So they're taking lots of images, and you see this morphology. Before, you sort of had this little bit of a spiky structure. Now it looks like a cauliflower, right? So a huge impact to the microstructure as you're doing this plating. When they do a strip cycle, they strip, and you see there's a few areas that are light here. In those light areas, it's where the lithium was trapped. So they're not able to actually access all of that lithium. And you'll see a shadow, right? So there's a little bit of this shadow structure here. This is this SEI layer. So when you deposit from ethylene carbonate, the electrolyte breaks down. And the electrolyte breaks down and forms a shell over the surface. And that's that residual shell that you're seeing. In some, often, I guess actually the energy storage community has gotten very good at tailoring this SEI layer and the chemistry of this SEI layer. So it's what used to be a problem is they've changed into a feature. When you start the second layer of plating now, you can see new globes forming, and it's continuing to get rougher. All right, so here's the gratuitous movie. All right, there's the plating. You can see all the globes, the orbs, the stripping now. You're getting some of them, but there's a few of these light bulbs that are left on. All right, so very obvious impact that the beam is having on the deposition. You know, initially you saw that was just a globe that was formed, so a very uniform structure. And when you did the plating, taking more images, you have a much higher impact on the structure. All right, so let's look a little bit more at this beam effect. From the beam effect, okay, here's again is a nice globe of lithium that was deposited. So this had a few cycles where they deposited and stripped and deposited and stripped. The beam wasn't on initially. Then they actually did a series where they held this, they deposited the lithium, they focused the beam in a corner and waited. And there was no real change in terms of looking at the surface, so there was no SEI that was deposited. But when they were depositing more lithium, and the beam was on, you start to form this SEI layer, or this thick SEI layer that's visible in the electron microscope. Now they did EELS measurements to actually look at this, and so this is an electron energy loss spectroscopy. So if you're not familiar with it, electron energy loss spectroscopy is when, as you have the electron moving through the system, if you measure the change in energy that it has at a given point, you can effectively, it's a Z contrast measurement technique. So you can look at what the atomic mass is in the different areas. So that's what they did, and they were able to demonstrate that, yes, this shell layer that's made is actually an SEI layer, so it has lithium that's locked in it, has broken down electrolyte that's locked in it, and interestingly, it forms as a shadow from where the beam was. So it's clearly charged, and it's only depositing when you're having the plating process going on. Okay, the beam is affecting it. Well, they also increased the current density. Right, so what's one of the other obvious knobs that they have? So the previous depositions were all done at this 10 milliamps per square centimeter. In this case, they increased the current now to 25 milliamps per square centimeter. So fairly high. I mean, I would think that 50 is what I would call a very fast plate of lithium. 25 is reasonably fast. 10 is fairly normal. And if you see a presentation where someone's talking about 1 milliamp per square centimeter, that's a pretty low rate of charge. All right, so what do you see? Well, now you get very large dendrites forming. So this is clearly unstable. And this is a situation which you wouldn't want to actually use in your energy storage system. So this is one of those fundamental limits of lithium in terms of when you're doing a lithium-based battery. If you increase your deposition potential, the instabilities in the surface cause dendrites to grow. And these dendrites can possibly pierce through your barrier layer between your anode and cathode, and that would then cause a short, which in turn volatilizes your electrolyte, and everything goes up in a rapid thermal process. All right, so let's take a quick step back and look a little bit at those dendrites. Well, here's a series of images of initially, right, so we saw this nice fairly globular structure prior to taking images. They started taking images, and you can see after the first cycle, you have dendrites that are now forming. Right, so high plating rates cause dendrites to grow. Also, this taking images with the TEM is clearly inducing these dendrites. But as we talked about, piercing of the barrier between the anode and cathode is an issue with dendrites. But there's also one other issue with anytime you form a dendrite like this, or form a thick SEI layer, and that's lithium is part of that reaction, is part of that material that's now caught in this SEI. And you can see it in the TEM, right? If it's showing as a light region, that's lithium that's locked up there. So that's lithium that's you're no longer able to shuttle between the anode and cathode. So you're losing efficiency. So it's a decrease in efficiency, and it's a decrease in the overall capacity of your battery. This is what Tesla is talking about with their 0.03% per cycle loss of energy storage capacity. So these dendrites or SEI layers as they thicken is an incredibly important aspect for us to be looking about how we can reduce that. Well, there's actually a good news story in these images, right? So here's that one particular dendrite. Looks a little bit like a grasshopper leg or something to me. As they cycle it, you can see at the very next cycle, here's that dendrite. It's still there, so that means it's electronically isolated from the anode, but it slowly dissolves away as they're continuing to plate. So that's actually good news, right? So that means that dendrites that you're forming, so this lost material, or no longer electronically active material, is being dissolved back into the electrolyte during the cycling. So that's a positive. So that means that you are actually going to get back that material, or get back that lithium, right? So there you go, it's gone. All right, so what are some of these observations? Well, the nanoscale morphology can be directly linked to the electronic properties that we're seeing. So again, we were just looking in a small window, but imagining that across the larger length scale of full battery. The morphology itself, I didn't really talk so much about the SEI thickness, refer you to the citation for that particular aspect, but there's a clear dependence on number of cycles and dependence on the deposition current, but there's also one other clear message. Though we can look and see what the microstructure is and how it's evolving, or the nanostructure, we still need better techniques for doing this characterization. And that represents another opportunity for us as a community, right? So that's a lot of what I've been trying to point at, is what are these opportunities for us to be looking at as a community of material scientists, and continuing to expand and develop new characterization techniques where we're not impacting the materials and the processes is an area where we have opportunity space. Okay. With that, I'm going to go into a couple slides of shameless advertising here. So this is the center which I just moved to, the Center for Nanophase Material Sciences. Don't ask me what the word nanophase actually means. I'm still not quite sure of that. But I do know what material science is. It looks a little bit like Hawaii here and almost like a palm tree, but this is actually in Tennessee. So sort of about a 6-hour drive out of DC, or 1-hour flight. So it's not that far. CNMS is part of a complex of 5 nanoscience centers around the US. So these are funded by the Department of Energy. So we have them located at Berkeley, at Argonne National Laboratories, Brookhaven, and then these are the 2 which I've been at. So I was at the New Mexico one, at Sandia National Laboratories, and now I'm here at Oak Ridge. What is a DOE user facility? Right, so these, just to get everyone sort of in the understanding that the verbiage that DOE likes to use, well, it's a research center that's open to the community. And so it's a free facility for anyone to come and perform science at. It's a collection of tools and capabilities, right? So we have a staff of about 80 scientists on roll, and they have techniques ranging from, so at CNMS we have 6 electron microscopes, 3 that are aberration corrected, so we have a large TEM facility. We have a number of other characterization and modeling aspects that are available. So all of this is available for the community to use. And who's that community? It's you, right? It's academic science and research community. And often we have students and postdocs that come and spend extended periods of time working with us at the facility. All right, so just looking at CNMS by the numbers. So right now, if you look at our current user portfolio, we have 109 U.S. institutions represented from 38 states. So each one of these dots is an institution where they have people coming to work at CNMS. You can see internationally, we also have 44 international institutes and 20 foreign countries where they have students and postdocs that are coming to Oak Ridge to work at the facility. By the numbers, so just to give you size scale, we're about 24 million a year. We have 600 visitors per year, around 400 projects, so you can have multiple people that are coming on a single project, and then we publish about 400 papers. So that's why does the Department of Energy fund these facilities? They fund these facilities because they care about the advancement of fundamental science. So they fund the facility to make it free for you to come and perform research there, and what do they want out? They want peer-reviewed publications. That's why they're doing it. If you look at CNMS, I just want to sort of highlight 3 aspects of the center, right? So what do we do within the facility? Creating materials. So there's a lot of work around synthesis and nanofabrication. So this is pulse laser deposition of oxides. This is 2D materials are certainly getting a lot of emphasis these days. We have a lot in the nanofabrication. So we have it's about a 10,000 square foot clean room facility that's class 1,000. So that has, the typical, right? So it has electron beam lithography, it has FIBS. We just purchased a new Wraith system where we can do single ion implants. So as the community starts to work more on quantum devices and starts to wonder, how can you deterministically place a single ion where you want it, and then build a device around that. So we just recently purchased this Wraith system for doing that. We also have a lot of emphasis on characterization, right? So you heard me talk about electron microscopy as one of those areas. So a lot around TEM, chemical imaging, so a suite of AFMs that are linked to TOF-SIMs is one of our capabilities that we have. So you can perform a study of a micro and nanostructure and also be looking at the chemistry at that length scale. And the theory is a critical component. So at Oak Ridge right now, they just going online is the Summit computer system, which for the next month or so is the fastest computer in the world. I'm sure China will have one immediately following that will be ever so slightly faster as the computer race continues. But that's also accessible through the CNMS facility. And then finally, as the last bit of this sort of shameless advertising here, we currently have a proposal called Open. And it's open until May 1st. And this is, writing essentially it's a 2-page proposal of the work that you want to do with the capabilities at CNMS. So these are not just the tools, these are the scientists that you want to come and perform work with. So with that, I will end, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk, and also open the door for cooperations.
Very nice talk, thank you. I have 2 questions regarding these lithium-based dendrites that you have shown. My first question is, you said that these dendrites could be also stimulated within the electron microscope. Mm-hmm. I would expect that if you go to lower acceleration voltages, maybe 80 keV, then the probability is lower. Mm-hmm. My question is this correct? And the second question regarding these dendrites is there are several applications that with carbon-based materials, with graphene or with diamond, it's possible to constrain the system and avoid this dendrite formation. What's your opinion about this approach?
Yes, certainly. You're absolutely right. As you want to decrease the interaction of the beam with the material, and so by going to lower voltages. So even if you could, there are systems now where you can start to look down at say 30 kilovolts acceleration. You're losing some ability in terms of the image quality. But that's also now being made up for by, say, like the Gatan K2 and K3 cameras. So this work was shown using a standard camera, but the new generation of cameras are single electron cameras. So each sensor only needs a single electron to hit it to form an image. So now your scan rates are dramatically increased, or you can decrease your dose rate by a few orders of magnitude. So yes, so decreasing beam current, but that has an impact on resolution and the number of electrons. But if you can offset that by using one of these direct electron cameras, you can start to decrease the overall impact. So yes, that is certainly an area which we should, where this work is going, is to look at that. Though they haven't done it at this point. Regarding some of these different insertion systems, yes, so there was a lot of excitement around carbon nanotubes and using these as a cage or other multi-wall carbon structures. They seem to be reasonably effective. I haven't seen anything that's actually hit commercially regarding one of these insertion systems. I know we did try some work a few years ago in the TEM looking at inserting into these multi-wall tubes, and though there is less dendrites that are grown, you start to see dendrites forming if you increase the current rate up. So they've looked at it a little bit. I don't know if it's a perfect solution. often what you're seeing, if you're talking specifically about lithium-based batteries, is they're going to engineered SEI layers. So that community is very often heading towards, can you use some sort of deposition ALD-like technique to pre-engineer that SEI layer, and then that essentially floats on top of the lithium as you're doing the plating, and it floats and recedes, versus the insertion mechanisms, which those are more similar to what is already being done within the standard graphite electrode. So it's sort of a variant of the standard insertion graphite electrode versus a lithium-based battery. So they're all active areas being explored.
Thank you very much. So, any other question? If not, I just would like to you spoke about the need of we have some extra energy in the peak and we have problems in storage, and you speak about we need the power electronics control, but we have also to control in the load, which means that not in the source, not in the load, which means that we could save the losses that you have on the cables. Yes. So, and for this, I think that we could try to work on transparent electronics where we can embed the devices on the PVs directly. What do you think about that?
Yes, well, certainly the any opportunity you have to not use an electron is much better than creating that electron. So efficient use of electricity is really a key place to work on. Regarding having batteries directly located on PV cells in terms of the storage system, the challenges which I've typically seen with those systems is the batteries get very hot. And so when you have the battery directly attached to a PV cell, you often lose round-trip efficiency or simply the amount of storage, the capacity of the battery, due to the temperature at which PV works at. So you need to have some local cooling in order for that to be effective. But yes, it's certainly been an active area of of work, and I think there's potential, but you need to be really trying to address this thermal issue.
Yeah, because the point is not to have a continuous process, but a discrete process. So you use a switch on when you need the energy, so you don't heat so much as you are thinking about. Anyhow. Yes. Any other question, please?
Peter Solmé from INL. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm wondering how in the US you are tackling with all the extra added costs for transmission, both at large scale and local scale, and also quality of the energy that's being produced locally, all these things. Because here in Europe, people are starting to, or in the European Parliament, they're starting to talk about even tax self-consumption, that you should pay a tax over that, even if you're not buying somewhere, but in order to support all these extra costs that are being. And are those numbers being considered also when you showed only the storage numbers, but there's also the transmission extra added cost for all this extra energy going back and forth?
Right. So to directly answer your question, no, in those costs, it was specifically only the systems themselves. So it was not looking at all those extra costs associated with it. PV is fantastic when each of us can put it on our homes, and we can be more efficient way of generating electricity. But still, ultimately, the utilities have to pay for all those transmission lines, and making sure that the electricity is there, whether or not our PV cells happen to be working. So there is always going to be a cost to that. And that, there are places where that is becoming a concern, certainly within the U. So I'm most familiar with the US. In Hawaii, electricity is primarily created via diesel generation. And right now their penetration of solar is about 30%. So it's really a very big penetration of solar cells particularly on homes, is where most of that 30% is. And they're having challenges in terms of supporting their grid's infrastructure because of all that local generation. Piece of you talk about quality of the electricity that comes off of that home generation varies from house to house. Simply having 30% penetration means it's very challenging for them to predict how much electricity they're going to have to be creating. For the frequency regulation, that occurs on about a 3-minute time scale in terms of how rapidly they have to respond to it, which also is a very challenging situation, particularly as there's one rogue cloud that may go across a housing community, and they need to respond to that. So I completely agree. It's very challenging. They haven't yet figured out the best answer, but it's going to end up resulting in us as a society paying more.
Thanks.
So, anyhow, thank you very much, and let's thanks.